Did hearts truly beat for love when the world was a brutal, unforgiving place? What happened to passion when plague swept through towns, wiping out entire families? Could affection survive when marriage was just a business deal, and duty meant long, dangerous absences? For anyone living in medieval times, from kings to peasants, love was not a soft whisper in a quiet room. It was a roar against the storm, a flicker against the darkness, constantly battling forces that wanted to snuff it out. Number 8. The shadow of the Black Death and disease. Life in medieval times was a fragile thing, often cut short by forces unseen and poorly understood. Before the scientific age, when germs were unknown and medicine was rudimentary, sickness was a constant lurking threat. Every scratch could fester, every cough could turn deadly, and the slightest fever might be the beginning of the end. This ever-present vulnerability meant that the bonds of love, whether between spouses, parents, and children, or close companions, were tested by the relentless shadow of disease. The most terrifying of these health crises was, without a doubt, the Black Death. When the Black Death arrived in Europe in the mid-14th century, it was not merely an epidemic. It was a catastrophic transformation of society, and it tore through the very fabric of human connection. From 1347 to 1351, this devastating plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas on rats, wiped out an estimated 30% to 50% of Europe's population. Villages became ghost towns. Cities overflowed with the dead, and the living struggled to comprehend the scale of the horror. For those in love, the plague presented an unthinkable challenge. A husband might wake beside his wife, and by evening she could be covered in the telltale black buboes convulsing in her death throes. A lover might bid farewell in the morning, only to hear hours later that his beloved had succumbed to the swift and merciless infection. The disease was terrifyingly swift. Victims often died within days, sometimes even hours, of the first symptoms appearing. There was no time for long goodbyes, no drawn-out farewells. Love was forced to confront immediate, brutal severance. Giovanni Boccaccio, writing in his Decameron, described how the plague stripped away normal human compassion. One citizen avoided another, and scarce any parent cared for his child, he recounted. This chilling observation highlights how extreme fear and the instinct for self-preservation could override even the strongest family and romantic ties. People might abandon sick loved ones, fearing contagion, or be unable to provide care due to their own illness or the sheer volume of the dying. The very act of mourning was disrupted, as bodies piled up faster than they could be buried, and proper funeral rites became impossible. This robbed survivors not only of their loved ones, but also of the customary ways to grieve and find closure, leaving emotional wounds that might never heal. Beyond the sudden, devastating blow of the Black Death, daily life was riddled with other more common illnesses that still chipped away at love's resilience. Dysentery, smallpox, measles, tuberculosis, and countless other ailments were endemic. Childhood mortality rates were astronomically high. It was common for a couple to lose multiple children before any reached adulthood. The joy of new life was often quickly followed by the crushing sorrow of death. A mother might spend years bearing children only to see most of them vanish before their 5th birthday. How did a husband and wife support each other through such repeated, profound grief? Did shared sorrow deepen their bond, or did it fray it, leaving them emotionally exhausted and distant? Constant threat to their offspring meant that love for children was intertwined with perpetual anxiety and a preparedness for loss that is alien to most modern parents. Medical knowledge was rudimentary, based on ancient theories like the Four Humors, and often combined with superstition and religious belief. Physicians, often learned men, might prescribe bleeding or bizarre concoctions of herbs and animal parts. When these remedies failed, as they often did, people turned to prayer, pilgrimage, or the intercession of saints. The helplessness in the face of widespread sickness was immense. When a loved one fell ill, there was little one could do but watch, pray, and hope. This helplessness, coupled with the immense emotional investment in a relationship, created a deep well of despair. When illness struck, The very act of caring for a sick partner or child was a test of courage and devotion, especially when the disease itself was contagious. The psychological impact of living with constant sickness was profound. It fostered a sense of fatalism, a belief that one's life was ultimately in the hands of God or fate, not human agency. This outlook could influence how love was expressed and experienced. Perhaps it made people cherish the fleeting moments of happiness more intensely, knowing they could be gone in an instant. Or perhaps it instilled a sense of resignation, making people more guarded against deep attachments, fearing the inevitable pain of loss. Chronicles from the period suggest that some people responded to the plague with wild abandon, embracing hedonism, believing that since death was imminent, one should enjoy life to its fullest. Others turned to fervent piety, convinced that the plague was divine punishment. Both reactions had implications for how individuals engaged in loving relationships, whether embracing them with fierce urgency or withdrawing into isolation. For those couples who survived the onslaught of disease, their love was forged in the fires of shared trauma and loss. They had witnessed unimaginable suffering, perhaps nursed each other through sickness and grieved together for lost family and friends. This shared history of survival could bind them with an unbreakable strength, a testament to their endurance. However, the constant presence of death also left deep emotional scars. It could make one wary of forming new attachments or create a lingering melancholy that permeated every aspect of life, including love. In an age where love was often not the primary reason for marriage, surviving the relentless tests of disease, and death became a crucial, unscripted crucible for determining the true strength of any bond. Number 7. The unyielding grip of feudal duty and absent lovers. In the medieval world, society was built upon a complex system known as feudalism, where land was held in exchange for service or labor. This system defined nearly every aspect of life, from a peasant's daily toil to a noble's grand obligations. For those who found themselves in positions of power or military service, feudal duty meant long, often dangerous absences from their homes and loved ones. This unyielding grip of obligation was a constant test for any blossoming love, forcing couples to contend with separation, uncertainty, and the ever-present threat of permanent loss. Lords, knights, and even their retainers were bound by oaths to their superiors. A knight swore fealty to his lord, promising military service in exchange for land or protection. This service could mean extended campaigns, far from home, defending borders, putting down rebellions, or engaging in foreign wars. A young squire, barely out of his youth, might be called away to serve his lord's castle, leaving behind a sweetheart he hoped to marry. A married knight might receive a summons to join his duke's army, embarking on a journey that could last months or even years, with no certainty of return. The wife left behind had no choice but to manage the household, oversee the estate, and raise the children, all while enduring the gnawing anxiety of her husband's absence. The journeys themselves were perilous. Travel was slow, dangerous, and arduous. Roads were poor, infested with bandits, and susceptible to the whims of weather. A knight, marching with his retinue, might face ambush, disease, or simply the brutal conditions of outdoor life. News traveled even slower, if at all. A wife waiting at home might go weeks or months without any word from her absent husband, living in a constant state of suspense. Rumors of battles, sieges, or widespread illness would filter back, leaving her to guess at her beloved's fate. Was he wounded? Was he captured? Was he dead? This agonizing uncertainty was a heavy burden on any loving relationship. For the nobility, military service was not just an obligation. It was an integral part of their identity and honor. A knight who shirked his duty brought shame upon himself and his family. This meant that personal desires, including the desire to stay with one's beloved, often had to be suppressed in favor of public duty. When a lord called, his vassals answered, no matter the personal cost. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the Middle Ages, saw both her first husband, Louis VII of France, and her second husband, Henry II of England, depart on military campaigns and crusades. Her own life was shaped by political alliances and obligations, highlighting how deeply intertwined personal relationships with the demands of power and duty. The impact of these prolonged absences on wives was significant. They were often left in charge of the household, managing estates, overseeing servants, and protecting family interests in their husband's stead. This required strength, intelligence, and resilience. While some women thrived in these roles, others might have found the burden overwhelming, especially if they were young or inexperienced. The emotional toll of separation, coupled with the practical demands of running an estate, created a unique strain on marital affection. Did the distance make the heart grow fonder, or did it allow the bonds to loosen, perhaps even fray over time? The return of a long-absent loved one was not always a simple reunion of joy. Years of separation could lead to significant changes in both individuals. A husband might return battle-hardened and traumatized, a stranger to the gentle man his wife remembered. A wife, having grown strong and independent in his absence, might find it difficult to relinquish control or adapt to his return. Children born during the father's absence might barely know him, creating a period of awkward adjustment. Historical accounts and ballads sometimes tell of knights returning unrecognized to their homes, testing the loyalty of their wives or the recognition of their children. While often romanticized, these stories touch on the very real challenges of reintegrating after years of separation. Even for those in less exalted positions, feudal duties could impose long absences. Peasants, though tied to the land, might be conscripted for short military service or labor, or sent to work on a lord's distant property. Apprentices left their homes to live and work with masters in other towns, often for many years, delaying marriage and the formation of their own families. Merchants traveled extensively, facing their own dangers on trade routes, leaving their wives and children to manage their businesses at home. These separations, while perhaps less dramatic than those of a knight going to war, still put strain on affectionate relationships, requiring patience, trust, and a deep longing for reunion. Constant possibility of death during these absences, whether from combat, disease, or accident, meant that every departure carried a silent, heavy weight. Lovers said goodbye, not knowing if it was truly the last time. This lurking fear permeated their affections, perhaps making them more fervent in their farewells, but also coloring their everyday lives with a persistent anxiety. The medieval chroniclers often focused on the grand political implications of feudal service, but beneath those narratives were countless personal stories of separation and yearning, of love enduring or faltering under the heavy hand of duty. The unyielding grip of feudal obligation meant that for many, love was not a continuous presence, but a series of fervent reunions punctuated by long, anxious periods of absence, a true test of its enduring strength. Number 6. When church bells tolled louder than heartbeats. In medieval Europe, the Catholic Church was not merely a religious institution. It was a dominant force that permeated every aspect of life, from politics and law to education and daily customs. Its doctrines shaped moral codes, dictated social behavior, and profoundly influenced matters of the heart. For many, the call of the Church, particularly the sacred vows of celibacy and monasticism, could often toll louder than the deepest human heartbeats, presenting a unique and formidable test to love, desire, and companionship. Church championed celibacy for its clergy, arguing that it allowed priests, monks, and nuns to dedicate themselves entirely to God, free from worldly distractions. While this ideal was not always perfectly observed, it was a powerful societal expectation. A young man, perhaps engaged to be married, or deeply in love, might feel a compelling spiritual call to enter the priesthood or a monastery. Similarly, a young woman, even if she harbored desires for a husband and children, might be pressured by family or drawn by piety. to take vows as a nun. For those who chose this path, it meant renouncing earthly love, forsaking marriage and procreation, and committing to a life of spiritual devotion. Consider the profound conflict that could arise when a strong affection clashed with a powerful spiritual calling. A couple might be deeply devoted to one another, planning a future together, only for one of them to experience a profound religious awakening that led them away from their earthly beloved. This was not a mere change of mind, it was a commitment to an entire way of life, often seen as a higher, more virtuous path. The pain of such a separation would be immense, a test not just of personal love, but of the strength of one's faith against human desire. The other woman, or other man, in this scenario, was not a rival individual, but God himself, an impossible force to contend with. The story of Peter Abelard and Heloise is perhaps the most famous, albeit extreme example of love tested by the Church's influence. Peter Abelard, a brilliant philosopher and theologian, and Heloise, his exceptionally intelligent student, fell deeply in love in 12th century Paris. Their passion led to a secret marriage and the birth of a child. However, their relationship scandalized Abelard's clerical colleagues and he was brutally punished. To protect Abelard and out of her own deep devotion, Heloise entered a convent, becoming a nun, while Abelard himself became a monk. Their subsequent correspondence, centuries later, reveals the lingering, profound nature of their earthly love, even as they lived lives dedicated to God. Heloise's letters, in particular, speak of her continued intense feelings for Abelard, even as she struggled to reconcile them with her religious vows. Their story shows a love that transcended physical separation and religious commitment, but was undoubtedly tested by the very demands of church life. Beyond formal vows, the Church's teachings instilled a pervasive sense of sinfulness regarding worldly pleasures, including sexual desire. While marriage was sanctioned and considered, holy, romantic passion outside of it was condemned. Even within marriage, the primary purpose was often seen as procreation, not romantic or sexual fulfillment. This pervasive moral framework could create a complex inner struggle for individuals in love. Did they experience guilt over the intensity of their feelings? Did they temper their affections to align with religious doctrines? For some, the ideal of spiritual love might have been elevated above earthly affection, leading them to question the very nature of their human relationships. The Church also influenced how marriages were formed and dissolved. While it generally upheld the sanctity of marriage, it also had specific rules regarding kinship, consent, and annulment. A couple might be deeply in love and wish to marry, only to find their union forbidden by the Church, due to a distant family relationship they never knew they had, or because one party had previously made a pre-contract to someone else. The Church's power to grant annulments, declaring a marriage invalid from the beginning, could also shatter existing bonds. While often sought for political reasons by the powerful, annulment could also be pursued on grounds of non-consummation or other canonical impediments, potentially tearing apart a loving couple if one party desired freedom from the other for reasons acceptable to church law. Moreover, the Church played a significant role in defining gender roles and expectations within relationships. Women were often encouraged to be pious, chaste, and subservient, mirroring the Virgin Mary. Men were expected to be righteous and provide for their families, while also maintaining spiritual discipline. These rigid expectations, while promoting a certain kind of order, could also stifle genuine emotional expression and restrict the ways in which love could be openly experienced or demonstrated within a marriage. A husband might be expected to prioritize spiritual duties over his wife's emotional needs, or a wife might feel constrained from expressing desires deemed worldly by church doctrine. Even practices like pilgrimage, heavily promoted by the Church, could lead to long separations that tested relationships. Many medieval people, driven by piety or seeking penance, embarked on arduous journeys to holy sites like Jerusalem, Rome, or Santiago de Compostela. These pilgrimages could last for months or even years, leaving spouses and families behind, facing the same anxieties and uncertainties as those separated by feudal duty or war. The motivation, however, was explicitly religious burdonatizing, a spiritual quest over domestic companionship. Thus, the powerful influence of the Church, with its emphasis on celibacy, its moral codes, its legal strictures regarding marriage, and its promotion of spiritual devotion, created a profound and pervasive set of challenges for love in medieval times. For some, it meant a choice between earthly affection and a perceived higher calling. For others, it shaped the very way they understood and expressed love, always under the watchful eye of divine judgment and the solemn tolling of the church bells. Number 5. The walls of caste and the whispers of forbidden desire. Medieval society was structured like a towering, unyielding pyramid, with the monarch at its peak, followed by powerful nobles. Then knights, clergy, merchants, and finally, the vast majority of peasants and serfs at its base. This rigid social hierarchy or caste system was deeply ingrained and rarely permeable. One's birth determined one's place, opportunities, and even who one could love or marry. For those who dared to feel a connection across these impermeable social walls, their desires were deemed forbidden, facing insurmountable obstacles, and often leading to whispers, scandal, and despair. Love across the class divide was not merely frowned upon, it was often seen as a threat to the established order. Marriage, especially among the nobility, was a strategic alliance, a means of consolidating land power and influence. It was not about personal affection or romantic compatibility. A noble son or daughter was expected to marry someone of equal or higher standing, securing advantageous alliances for their family. To marry someone from a lower class would be to dilute the family's prestige, lose land, and potentially even forfeit their standing. Such unions were almost unheard of, and if they occurred would likely be met with severe disapproval, disinheritance, or even violence. Imagine a young knight, son of a minor lord, falling deeply in love with a beautiful peasant girl he encounters in the village. Their worlds were entirely separate. He was trained in chivalry, warfare, and courtly manners. She was accustomed to arduous agricultural labor and a life of simplicity. A marriage between them was virtually impossible. He could not marry her without losing his inheritance, shaming his family, and abandoning his duties. She could not rise to his station, nor could she be accepted by his peers. Any children they had would be illegitimate, stripped of his noble name and prospects. Their love, if it was to exist, would have to be secret, illicit, and devoid of any hope for a legitimate future. Together, such a relationship, often portrayed in romantic ballads, with a tragic ending, highlights the brutal reality of the social divisions. Even within the nobility, marriage between different levels of the aristocracy could be problematic. A wealthy countess might be considered too good for a mere knight, even if he was of noble birth. Royal marriages were the ultimate expression of political calculation, often involving partners from different kingdoms who had never met. Personal preferences were utterly irrelevant in these high-stakes negotiations. If a prince harbored affection for a lady-in-waiting, or a princess developed feelings for a courtier, such desires would be quashed swiftly and decisively, as they jeopardized the dynastic plans of entire nations. The individual's happiness was secondary to the stability and power of the realm. For the vast majority of the population, the peasants and serfs, marriage was also tied to their social status and land. A serf could not simply leave the land to marry someone from a different lord's manor without permission, as they were tied to the soil they worked. Marriages were often arranged by village elders or the lord himself, ensuring that labor was maintained and families remained productive units. While personal affection might grow within such marriages, the initial union was rarely based on it. If a young peasant girl fell for a traveling craftsman or a merchant, their different social mobility and economic statuses could make a sustained relationship difficult. As the craftsman would move on, and the peasant would remain tied to her village, the church, while theoretically promoting the spiritual equality of all souls, did little to dismantle the social hierarchy and often reinforced it. It condemned unions that were considered incestuous or too closely related by kinship, but generally did not interfere with arranged marriages based on class distinctions, viewing them as matters of earthly order. While the church sometimes offered a path to social mobility through the clergy for talented individuals from humble backgrounds, this path typically required celibacy, thus closing off avenues for romantic partnership within their new elevated status. Sometimes the forbidden desire would lead to desperate measures. Elopement was a dangerous and rare act, especially for those crossing significant class lines. It meant abandoning one's family, one's social standing, and often one's means of survival. A noblewoman, eloping with a commoner, would become an outcast, potentially disinherited and disowned, facing poverty and disgrace. A peasant attempting to run away with someone from a distant village might face capture and harsh punishment from their lord. The risks were so immense that such acts of rebellion were few, a testament to the powerful grip of the social order. Prevalence of illicit relationships, whether between a lord and a peasant girl or a married noble and a commoner, points to the undeniable persistence of human desire, despite these barriers. However, these relationships were often exploitative, temporary, and carried significant risks, particularly for the lower status individual. Such unions were rarely about mutual love and companionship, but rather about power dynamics and fleeting attractions. They serve as a stark reminder that while desire might have crossed class lines, true, enduring love and legitimate partnership almost never could. The walls of caste were strong, often proving impregnable to the whispers of forbidden desire, leaving heartbreak, secret shame, or unfulfilled longing in their wake. Number 4. The idealized illusion of courtly love. One of the most intriguing and often misunderstood concepts of medieval love is courtly love, or finamer, flourishing primarily in the 12th and 13th centuries, especially among the nobility and courts. Like that of Eleanor of Aquitaine, courtly love was less about genuine romantic partnership and more about an elaborate, idealized, and often unconsummated devotion. This cultural phenomenon presented a complex test for love, shaping expectations and behaviors in ways that could be both inspiring and deeply frustrating. At its core, courtly love was a literary construct celebrated in the songs of troubadours and the narratives of chivalric romances. Typically involved a knight or aspiring lover dedicating himself wholly to a noble lady, who was almost always married to someone else of higher status. The love was usually secret, intense, and filled with longing. The knight would perform great deeds, compose poetry, and endure trials, all to win a mere glance, a token, or perhaps a fleeting moment of favor from his lady. The lady, in turn, was portrayed as a distant, beautiful, and often unattainable object of adoration. The key aspects of courtly love made it a test for genuine affection. First, it was explicitly extramarital. The ideal lady was married, and her husband was typically a powerful figure, often the knight's own lord. This meant the love was inherently adulterous in nature, though often platonic. The physical consummation of the love was usually avoided in the literary ideal, as it would destroy its purity and elevate it from a spiritual refining passion to a base sinful act. This emphasis on unconsummated desire meant that the lover's devotion was tested by constant yearning and self-restraint. How could a genuine reciprocal love truly flourish under such conditions of imposed distance and denied intimacy? Second, courtly love was characterized by humility and service. The knight was entirely subservient to his lady, pledging absolute devotion and obedience to her every wish. He would suffer greatly for her, endure pain and humiliation, all for the hope of her recognition. This dynamic placed the lady on a pedestal, making her almost a goddess, while the knight was her humble servant. This highly unequal power, dynamic while romantic in theory, might have stifled true emotional equality or mutual affection. Could a lord accustomed to commanding truly be humbled to such a degree, or was it a performative act? Third, courtly love was seen as a refining, ennobling force. Through his devotion to his lady, the knight was supposed to become a better man, more courageous, more virtuous, more skilled in arms and poetry. His love was a source of inspiration for feats of chivalry. This spiritual elevation was considered more important than any physical union. The love was not for happiness or companionship, but for moral improvement and the display of honor. This concept of love as a means to self-improvement rather than an end in itself placed a heavy burden on the individual. The love was a path to personal virtue, but what of the emotional needs of the individuals involved? The practical implications of courtly love were complex. In a courtly setting, this love might have been a form of social game, a sophisticated flirtation, or a way to demonstrate one's adherence to fashionable cultural norms. A knight might publicly declare his love for a lady, compose poems for her, and wear her colors, all within the accepted boundaries of courtly etiquette. But beneath the surface, real emotions could certainly develop. A knight might genuinely fall for his lady, and she, perhaps trapped in an arranged, loveless marriage, might genuinely reciprocate his affections. This could lead to intense emotional torment, as they were bound by the strictures of the courtly game and societal norms to keep their feelings platonic and unexpressed beyond the bounds of formal admiration. The legendary story of Lancelot and Guinevere from the Arthurian cycle is the quintessential example of courtly love taken to its tragic extreme. Lancelot, King Arthur's greatest knight, falls in love with Queen Guinevere, his liege lord's wife. Their love is passionate, forbidden, and ultimately leads to the downfall of Camelot. Their story, though fictional, powerfully illustrates the inherent conflict in courtly love, the tension between idealization and human desire, between loyalty to a lord and loyalty to a beloved, and between the public performance of virtue and the private agony of a forbidden heart. Chink is how a love, idealized as ennobling, could in reality lead to immense suffering and destruction. While courtly love was largely an aristocratic phenomenon, its ideals permeated down through society to some extent, influencing perceptions of romance. And desire created a pervasive cultural narrative where love was equated with suffering, longing, and unattainable ideals. For anyone seeking a practical, affectionate, and reciprocal relationship within marriage, the idealized illusion of courtly love presented a stark contrast, perhaps, making their own, more mundane affections seem less noble or exciting. This set an almost impossible standard for genuine marital love, which was often based on practical considerations rather than the passionate yet distant devotion celebrated in the romances. The idealized illusion of courtly love, therefore, was a significant test, demanding emotional suppression, impossible standards, and often an acceptance of permanent unfulfillment for the sake of an aesthetic ideal. Number 3. The long march of crusades and endless waiting. The medieval period was punctuated by a series of religious wars known as the Crusades, launched primarily by European Christians to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim rule. These campaigns, spanning from the late 11th to the late 13th centuries, were massive undertakings that involved tens of thousands of knights, soldiers, and even ordinary pilgrims. For those who embarked on these perilous journeys, and for the loved ones they left behind, the Crusades represented one of the most profound and drawn-out tests of love, demanding extreme patience, enduring faith, and a capacity for endless waiting. When a knight took the cross, he made a solemn vow to embark on the crusade, often selling or mortgaging his lands to finance the expedition. This decision was driven by religious fervor, the promise of spiritual reward, and sometimes a desire for adventure or material gain. but it meant leaving behind everything familiar, including his wife, children, and home. The journey itself was incredibly long and arduous. Crusaders marched thousands of miles across unfamiliar and often hostile territory, enduring harsh weather, scarce provisions, and constant threat of attack. They often traveled for months or even years, simply to reach their destination in the Levant. For the wives left behind, the Crusades brought an unbearable period of uncertainty and anxiety. Their husbands were gone for years. Often 5 years or more, for round-trip communication was virtually non-existent. There were no letters delivered reliably, no way to know if their beloved was alive or dead, healthy or wounded, captured or free. Rumors would filter back from the east, vague and unreliable, about battles fought and lives lost. A woman might hear that her husband's contingent had been ambushed, or that many had fallen to disease during a siege. The lack of definitive news meant living in a perpetual state of limbo, unable to fully grieve or move on. The economic and practical burden on the absent crusader's wife was also immense. She often had to manage the estate, overseeing finances, crops, and servants. This was a heavy responsibility, especially for women who had previously relied on their husbands for such duties. They had to protect the family's lands from encroaching neighbors, fend off opportunistic lords, and ensure the children were cared for. Many crusaders faced financial ruin upon their return, or their families struggled deeply in their absence, adding practical worries to emotional ones. The stress of maintaining the household and family reputation while her husband was away could be a lonely and demanding test of her own strength. The long absences created fertile ground for temptations and suspicions. For the crusaders themselves, far from home, facing intense hardship, there were opportunities for illicit relationships, or simply forgetting the bonds. There were also pressures. Some might have been courted by other men, perhaps even pressured into new marriages, if their husband was presumed dead. Church, while upholding the sanctity of marriage, did offer provisions for wives of crusaders to remarry if their husbands did not return after a certain number of years, or if credible news of their death arrived. This added another layer of complexity to the test of love. How long did one wait? When did hope turn to the need for a new life? Many crusaders never returned. They died in battle, succumbed to disease, or were captured, and never ransomed. For their wives and families, the news of death might never arrive, or it might come years later, confirming the worst fears they had harbored for so long. Children of crusaders often grew up without ever knowing their fathers, or remembering them only as distant figures who departed when they were infants. This left emotional voids that stretched across generations. The very nature of the crusade, being a religious endeavor, also tested love in a spiritual sense. The crusader was seen as a holy warrior making a sacrifice for God. His family might have been expected to bear their separation with pious resignation, believing their sacrifice contributed to his salvation and the glory of God. This spiritual framing could elevate the hardship, but it did not diminish the personal pain of separation and loss. The ideal of love for God often overshadowed or even competed with the love for one's earthly partner. Stories and ballads from the period often depict the steadfastness of women waiting for their crusader husbands, highlighting their loyalty and endurance. These narratives served as cultural models, reinforcing the expectation of fidelity and patience. However, the reality was undoubtedly more complex, with some marriages surely breaking under the immense strain, while others, perhaps through shared faith and an enduring bond, found new depth in their eventual, longed-for reunions. The Long March of the Crusades was not just a military campaign. It was a profound human drama where love was stretched to its breaking point by distance, danger, and the endless agonizing act of waiting. Number 2. The silent pressure of producing an heir. In medieval society, especially among the nobility and landowners, marriage was rarely a union of romantic love. It was a strategic alliance, a means of securing power, land, and lineage. Central to this entire system was the absolute necessity of producing an heir, specifically a male heir. This silent yet immense pressure exerted a profound test on couples, shaping their relationships, influencing their actions, and often dictating the very survival of their love and marriage. Regardless of personal affection, the primary purpose of a noble marriage was dynastic succession. The husband's family line had to continue. His lands and titles had to be passed on and his name preserved. A wife's value was significantly tied to her fertility and her ability to produce healthy sons. If a couple failed to produce an heir, or only produced daughters, the marriage was considered to have failed its most critical function. This placed an immense burden on the wife, who was almost always blamed for barrenness. Even though the issue could just as easily lie with the husband, the pressure began immediately after marriage. Young noblewomen were often married in their early teens, primarily to ensure they could begin bearing children quickly. The lack of a male heir after a few years could lead to anxiety, speculation, and even drastic measures. Chroniclers often record the desperate efforts of royal and noble couples to produce offspring, from pilgrimages to shrines to prayers to employing various folk remedies and superstitions. The private intimacy of the marital bed was overlaid with the weight of public expectation and dynastic future. If a wife was barren, or if she only produced daughters, the situation became precarious. Daughters, while valuable for forging new alliances through marriage, could not typically inherit major titles or lands in their own right, especially if there was a male relative who could claim them. The fear of a line dying out or of lands falling into the hands of rivals was a constant concern for powerful families. In such circumstances, a husband might seek an annulment, arguing that the marriage was invalid from the beginning, for example, due to a pre-contract or a hidden kinship link, even if distant. An annulment, unlike a divorce, declared that the marriage had never truly existed in the eyes of the church. This allowed the husband to remarry and seek an heir elsewhere. This system put immense pressure on the wife. Her worth and security within the marriage often depended on her fertility. A barren wife could face public humiliation, ostracism, or even the threat of being sent to a convent. She could be discarded. Her entire life trajectory altered because of something beyond her control. Eleanor of Aquitaine experienced this pressure firsthand. Despite producing 2 daughters with Louis VII of France, their failure to produce a male heir was a significant factor in their annulment. She then married Henry II of England and bore him 8 children, including 5 sons, securing her legacy and proving her fertility, which was essential for her power and influence. Even if a couple produced sons, the high infant and child mortality rates meant that these heirs were always vulnerable. A family might rejoice at the birth of a healthy son, only to see him succumb to childhood illness. Within a few years, this meant the pressure to continue producing heirs remained even if previous children had been born. This constant cycle of birth, hope, and potential loss added another layer of anxiety to the marital bond. A couple might be deeply in love, but if they failed to secure the lineage, their affection might be overshadowed by the profound disappointment and societal disapproval. For those lower down the social ladder, such as wealthy merchants or prosperous peasants, the pressure to produce heirs also existed, albeit less dramatically. A son was vital to continue the family business, to inherit the farm, or to provide for parents in their old age. While annulment might be less common, the social stigma of childlessness or the financial insecurity of having no one to carry on the family's labor could still strain a marriage. The impact of this pressure on the emotional lives of couples was profound. Love might have been a secondary consideration, developing over time or existing despite the circumstances. But the constant awareness of their biological imperative, the scrutiny of their family and court, and the potential consequences of failure meant that their relationship was always under a specific kind of stress. Could true intimacy flourish when their very union was so explicitly tied to the production of progeny? Did the joy of a child's birth strengthen bonds, or was it merely a relief that a crucial duty had been fulfilled? The silent pressure of producing an heir was a fundamental, unavoidable test, often determining the very longevity and perceived success of a medieval marriage, regardless of the love within it. Number 1. The cold calculations of arranged marriages. Forget about whirlwind romances and grand declarations of love at first sight. For most people in medieval times, especially among the nobility and the burgeoning merchant class, marriage was not about personal affection. It was a cold, calculated business deal, a strategic alliance between families, a means of accumulating or consolidating wealth, land, and power. This fundamental reality meant that love, if it ever developed, was something that came after the wedding, a happy accident rather than a prerequisite. The very foundation of medieval marital life was for many a test of whether genuine affection could blossom in the absence of initial romantic inclination. Among the aristocracy, marriages were meticulously negotiated by parents, guardians, or powerful patrons, often when the prospective bride and groom were still children or very young adolescents. The primary considerations were land titles, alliances, and political advantage. A marriage could end feuds between powerful families, unite warring kingdoms, or secure a crucial heir for a struggling dynasty. Personal feelings were simply irrelevant. A young woman might be sent to live with her future husband's family years before the wedding, to be raised in their customs and taught her future duties. She might not even meet her husband until the day of the ceremony. Consider the feelings of a young noblewoman, perhaps married at 12 or 14 to a man twice her age, whom she had never met from a distant land, speaking a different dialect. Her fate was sealed by her family's needs, not her own desires. She was a pawn in a larger game, her body and potential fertility a valuable commodity. Her duty was to be obedient, manage the household, and produce heirs. Any hope for companionship or affection would have to be cultivated slowly, if at all. Over years of shared life, this was a relationship built on duty, not desire. The lack of choice extended to men as well, though perhaps with slightly more agency. A young lord might be expected to marry a woman who brought significant dowry or political connections, even if she was unattractive or personally disagreeable to him. His familial duty often outweighed any personal preferences he might have developed for another woman. To defy his family's wishes could mean disinheritance or ostracization, a price few were willing to pay. Even among the peasant classes, though marriage was often less formally arranged by distant lords, it was still heavily influenced by practical consideration. Marriage often meant the merging of two working hands, two families sharing labor or resources. A young man and woman might be encouraged to marry within their village, or to someone who owned a suitable parcel of land, or who could provide assistance in the fields. While love might have played a larger role here than in the high nobility, the emphasis was still on the practical realities of survival and community. A young woman might choose a husband based on his ability to provide his strength or his family's reputation, rather than on any passionate affection. The Church, while emphasizing the sanctity of marriage and requiring consent, often interpreted consent in a way that accommodated social pressures. A forced marriage was technically invalid, but demonstrating force was difficult in a society where children were expected to obey their parents in all matters of life and death, especially marriage. While the Church frowned upon coercion, it largely accepted the practice of arranged marriages as the norm, provided the parties eventually gave a nominal consent. This system of arranged marriages created a profound test for the development of love. Could affection grow from duty? Could respect turn into companionship? Could physical intimacy, initially a contractual obligation, ever become an expression of genuine desire? For some couples it did. Shared experiences, raising children, facing hardships together, and simply the passage of time could foster a deep bond of affection and loyalty. Many medieval marriages likely became strong partnerships rooted in mutual respect and shared interests, even if they lacked the initial spark of romantic love. However, for others, the cold calculations led to emotional barrenness. Some marriages were simply endured, relationships of convenience or necessity rather than genuine connection. Spouses might find companionship elsewhere, in friendships or even illicit relationships, because their own marriage offered no emotional fulfillment. The prevalence of courtly love, as discussed earlier, might be seen as a direct response to this reality, an idealized romantic outlet for those trapped in practical but passionless marriages. The narratives of medieval kings and queens are replete with examples of political marriages. Eleanor of Aquitaine's marriages to Louis VII and Henry II were prime examples of political calculation. Isabella of France, known as the She-Wolf of France, was married to Edward II of England as a strategic alliance. Their marriage was notoriously unhappy, ultimately leading to conflict and tragedy, highlighting how personal incompatibility could destabilize even the most politically advantageous unions. These stories underscore that even if the calculation was initially sound, the human element of love, or its absence, could have far-reaching consequences. Thus, the cold calculations of arranged marriages were perhaps the most fundamental test of love in medieval times. Love was not the starting point, but a potential, often unlikely destination. It was forced to fight against the tide of practicality, duty, and dynastic imperative left to blossom in the infertile ground of necessity, or wither in its harsh reality.